But welcome. Thanks for coming to our March Lunch and Learn. We're glad you could be here. Let us know where you're joining from in the chat. We'd love to hear that. I'm Julie Brown. I am the Raptor Migration and Programs Director at the Hawk Migration Association. And I'm running things today with Kat Lauer, my colleague, Engagement and Communications Coordinator at HMA. And spring migration is here. Finally, lots of Hawkwatch sites are reporting to Hawk count, and this is definitely the perfect time to refresh our ID skills, whether you're a beginning Hawkwatcher or a seasoned Hawkwatcher. This presentation is going to get you ready for Hawkwatch season. We are excited to welcome Josh Haas. He's run this fantastic program for us in the past. And I'm sure a lot of you remember seeing Josh back when he was on our board and helped run these lunch and learns for many years. He's still very involved, particularly in keeping our website up and running. And he has a great eye for not only IDing hawks, but photographing them and sharing and teaching what he knows. So before Kat introduces Josh, I'll just give a little background on the Hawk Migration Association for those of you who may be new to our organization. We're a nonprofit organization that provides support to the Raptor Migration Monitoring Network across the Americas. There are about 200 active Hawkwatch sites throughout North, Central, and South America, and they monitor migration during the spring and fall and report those data to our database hawkcount.org. We provide resources to the monitoring network, protocols, data sheets, data support, and a number of annual grants for Hawkwatch sites and for research. And we also do all the education we can, offering educational resources like Hawk ID materials. And we're an active partner of RPI, the Raptor Population Index. And that is an effort to produce conservation assessments and population trend analyses using all those long-term migration data sets. So you can learn more about what we do at hawkmigration.org or check out our database, hawkcount.org. And we are recording as always today. We're also live streaming on our Facebook page. You can check out any of the lunch and learns there on our Facebook page or on our website. I'll be sending out an email to participants once the recording is up online if you want to go and revisit it again. We also have over 50 recordings up on our website you can check out anytime. We're muting everybody to avoid distraction, but we love to connect with you in the chat. So ask questions, make comments there. Kat will be monitoring the chat and we'll give your questions to Josh at the end of the program. And lastly, if you don't already receive our e-newsletter, that goes out about twice a month. You can do that by just sending me or putting your name and email in the chat, and I'll add you to that. So I'll hand things over to Kat to introduce Josh.
Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And as Julie said, please let us know where you're coming from. I can see a lot of people have already put their locations in, and it's really great to see. I will be monitoring the chat and I'll be answering questions, asking questions to Josh at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce Josh Haas. He first developed a love of raptors working with birds of prey at the Kalamazoo Nature Center. A hawk-watching trip to Lake Erie Metro Park opened his eyes to raptors in migration. Perplexed by seeing specks at a distance with an overwhelming itch to know what they were, he started learning from veteran hawk watchers and was hooked. He would end up spending 7 fall seasons working with the Detroit River Hawkwatch as a relief counter. There, he honed skills and developed a love for teaching visitors unique ways of telling those shadowy specks apart. This, combined with his experience in bird photography and videography, took his teaching to a new level. His goal of making Raptors accessible to everyone spawned his movie Hawks on the Wing, teaching viewers Raptors in flight through the use of video and audio commentary. Josh's passion started with Raptors, and he can be found birding and photographing in all seasons, often with his wife, daughter, and son. Thank you so much, Josh. Please begin when you're ready.
All right, thank you. Just want to make sure you can hear me, and see the screen. All right, thumbs up. So good to go. Well, I want to welcome everybody here as well. And the reason for that is we'll talk a little bit more about this, but Raptor ID is a very, very hard skill set that I'm sure many of you have struggled with, as I have over the years, and continue to have these mystery birds that give us questions. So the first thing that I want to say is that's okay. And so don't put too much pressure on yourself to worry about identifying every single bird. Worry less about that pressure and more about enjoying what we love so much, and that is raptors in migration and in flight. Now, to get started, Julie mentioned a little thing called hawk count. So I'm not going to give any, migration overview today. It's really going to be centered on raptor identification. But what that starts with is you making a deliberate choice to spend time and put the effort in deliberately for learning either a species or a group of species. And what I always like to share from a hawk count perspective is this amazing resource that you have at your fingertips to plan your trips. And one of the first things I'll do and recommend to people that are using hawk count is to explore a site that might be near you or near a place that you're going. And one of the beautiful things that you can do is you can look at the species timing and look at these graphs to get an idea of, hey, when should I expect to see golden eagles? Or when should I expect to see broad-winged hawks? And in some cases, there's carryover, as you can see here, across many of these species. But in others, when you're thinking about a late season migrant like, your broad-winged versus an early spring migrant like adult golden eagles or rough-legged hawks, you might want to time your visit accordingly. So if you want to learn rough-legged hawks, you want to go earlier in a spring season or later in a fall season. So you can use hawk count to your advantage in this way. Having said that, let's get into some of the raptor identification tips that I really am excited to share with you today. And it really starts by just, again, encouraging you to not put too much pressure on yourself and really be deliberate in choosing a subset of birds that you really want to work on. One of my favorite sayings is, don't try to boil the ocean. Don't think that you're going to go to a hawk watch and be an expert with 16 or 17 species after spending an hour there or even a day. I don't really even consider myself an expert. There might even be some of my partners online here that are great hawk watchers and excellent teachers at getting people to understand how to identify these birds. In fact, engage in the chat. We're going to learn together. If you have your own tips to share, please absolutely do that. Every time I go hawk watching with someone, I learn something new as well. So be willing to do that. But I always like to say that, identification here is really where science and art collide. There is a lot of science to it when we talk about the mechanics of flight, how they're flapping their wings, the difference in their flight styles, things of that nature. But sometimes there's a feel aspect to identifying these birds. And so it's important to know that you don't have to be a trained scientist to do this. You can, bring yourself and look for ways that make you connect and solidify something in your brain. You have to think about what makes sense to you and what creates a lasting memory. Most importantly, you can't look at an accipiter like a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned and, for instance, just look at that squared off tail and immediately say that has to be a sharp-shinned hawk. There is always some variance and it's never 100%. So really, make that a tenet as you start getting into identifying these birds. I also, there's nothing better than being in the field. What we're going to do today is kind of second best, not to undersell what we're doing here today, but going out in the field, going to a hawk watch, even if you're in proximity, just listening to those those folks that are identifying these birds, that is without a doubt, the best way to learn, these really rich skills. Always have a continuous learning mindset and do things like these opportunities at the right time. Try to have this just-in-time kind of training mindset where we are just starting our spring hawk watching season. This is deliberate why we're doing this talk right now. So the goal here is to prepare you to get comfortable with some of these birds and then do your best to get out there into the field as soon as possible. And as I mentioned, don't put so much pressure on yourself that you need to identify everything. Be willing to take risks, call things out, lay your pride down, and don't be afraid to be wrong. Now, many of us are birders at heart, and when we're identifying our colorful warblers or any neotropic, songbird that's in migration or out in our backyards, we're not looking typically for how they fly. We're looking at what are their colorations, what do they look like, do they have an eye ring, what color are their legs, things like that. With raptors, especially in flight, you don't have the luxury to see those kinds of field marks, especially in spring. If you think about spring, these birds are migrating up from the south to the north. So let's think about that big ball in the sky that's to our south when we're on a hawk deck. We're looking straight into the sun, which basically means the peregrine that we see on the screen is going to look like the one on the right, full dark shadow. So field marks, they don't work. You have to really look at flight mechanics, how the bird is flapping, its behavior in the sky, things of that nature, and that's what we're going to focus on today. As I mentioned, you have to gather more than one trait. It's all about getting some of the pieces of the puzzle. You don't need all of them. Once you start to see the patagial bar here and some of the shape of the wing, even before the last puzzle piece comes in, showing the red tail, we do know from experience that this is a red-tailed hawk. That will come with practice. The point here is that you don't need all the pieces of the puzzle. You just need a portion of them, but you definitely need more than one. So just in terms of the general families, and today is going to focus mostly on eastern birds. That's where, I focus most of my experience. Not that there's not carryover. You're going to see some carryovers for those folks in the West. But just in terms of the general families, we have our accipiters, which are sharp-shinned hawks, the goshawk, Cooper's hawk. We can see here this is a Sharpie. Next, we'll talk through some falcons. We'll have our kestrel and merlin today. We won't focus on the peregrine because we have to have a limited subset today. But these are our fast-moving, flapping type raptors that don't soar as often. Then we get into our soaring birds, the bootios, like our red-tailed hawks, the famous broad-winged hawk, rough-legged hawks for the specialties in our northern sites, things of that nature. Then our eagles, and today we'll look at both the bald and golden eagle, which is perfect time. Early spring, the adult golden eagles are coming through. As the migration gets on, we'll start to see the subadults and the juvenile birds starting to come through. And then finally, the more specialties. This is not a single family by any means, but we have our ospreys, the very unique bird that we'll see, especially at lake or ocean side sites. And then our harriers, of course, the northern harrier, which we see here today. Now, just to kind of level set and give everybody a foundation for how we're going to do today, how we're going to run this, every one of these slides will be the same in that you have some quick ID tips at the bottom. You'll see a range map for each bird, which I'll talk through that a little bit, but range maps are hugely important to us to know timing and when to expect these birds coming through. You'll see just a single photo in most cases of the bird. Obviously, please reference your Liguori, your Wheeler, and some of these other great books to see all the different views and different plumages of these birds. But for today's purpose, it's less about plumage and more about flight. And so you'll just see a quick photo to show the shape of the bird. And then one of my favorite parts of these slides is the soaring profile and the glide profile. We'll talk about the differences here, but these are hugely important for comparing things like our Coopers to our sharp-shinned when they're soaring. Whereas when they're gliding, they're roughly the same profile, so you don't have that advantage. So we'll talk through that a little bit. Now, before we start, I want to level set the difference between active flight, flapping and gliding, and soaring. So soaring is the bird that is rising in altitude, oftentimes going in circles taking advantage of typically thermal air that's giving them rise and free lift. And they're basically rising in altitude and going in circles. So that's what we will define as soaring today. In terms of active flight and flapping and gliding, it's thinking about birds that are going from point A to point B in more or less a straight line fashion. They're either going to glide the whole way. In some cases, we see bald eagles do this, or they're going to flap the whole way, like our Merlin, say falcons will do. And then we have those birds that kind of do the in-between, red-shouldered hawks, our accipiters, where they'll flap, 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 glide and repeat. But the key here is they're going from point A to point B. So just want to level set those two differences. So getting started, we're going to hit our accipiters first. We'll focus on sharp-shinned, or as a lot of us call them, our sharpies. So looking at the soaring profile, very flat, the glide profile, the wings are held in a slight downward position. These birds are incredibly buoyant, very, very snappy wing beat, very, very rapid, so very, very quick wing beat. And it looks like it comes from the wrist versus using the whole wing. So if I'm pointing out what we would say like the wrist of the bird, it's using the wing from this point outwards towards the tip, less using the entire wing. And we'll see that when we compare the Sharpie to the coop. Oftentimes you can see here that the head is smaller and the wings are thrown forward, the wrists are thrown forward. So what I say is it kind of creates this little pocket for the tiny head to sit nicely within. So the beauty of today is, while you can see this one single image for every one of these birds, we're actually going to go to a video where we can see them flying real time in the sky. So starting with our Sharpie, he's going to be soaring. Look at the long tail, and when it's fanned out, there's this little tiny pinch point where the tail meets the body. When it comes around, you'll see like this tiny little pinch point. Also notice the shoulders are thrown just slightly forward in a soar, but they're mostly perpendicular. Notice how tiny that head is. It's really, really small relative to Cooper's, which we'll see next. Here's that really rapid butterfly-like buoyant wing flap. Notice that it's kind of from the wrists outward. It's not using the entire wing. It's not as deep as we're going to see in the Coopers next. And it's the fastest wing beat you're going to see along from all the species that we're going to go through today. So here in active flight, notice those wings are slightly downturned, where in the soar they were basically flat. The same wing flap that's very rapid and stiff. However, there's that little pocket that I was talking about for the head to sit nicely within. Flat, 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 glide, flat, 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 glide. That's what we're going to see in our sharp-shinned hawks. Moving on to our Cooper's hawk, think of this as a slightly larger version in most cases than our Sharpie, but we have to be very, very careful with size, because when we see a single bird in flight out in the sky, there's really nothing to compare relative size to. So that means that a Cooper's hawk could look very, very large or small to you, depending on male, female, how high or how low in altitude it is, and things of that nature. So be careful with that. However, Coopers are a slightly larger accipiter where their tail is very long, similar to the Sharpie. You won't see that pinch point that I was talking about. There's a little bit more substance to the tail where it meets the body. Also notice here we see a more perpendicular line to the wings, especially that leading edge, the front edge of the wing. It's perpendicular to the body. While this picture doesn't show the wings, the wrist thrown forward, Cooper's hawks will push their wings forward, their shoulders forward in high winds, especially in active flight. So that's not 100%, but typically we're going to see Cooper's hawk with a more perpendicular wing relative to its body. Also notice the head is projecting further forward in front. It's a much larger head relative to the Sharpie, so that's something that we're going to look for. The last thing I'll point out here, and we'll look for this in the video, is look at that soar profile. It's closer to like a red-tailed hawk where we have a slight upturned dihedral, that upturned look to the wing. So let's look for that as we see our Cooper's hawk starting to soar. Notice the tail is more substantial. It's heavier. That pinch point is not there. As the bird comes along, look for that upturn, just a very slight upturn. A little hard to see there, but it's very, very subtle. But if you had these birds side by side with the coop and the Sharpie, you would see that the coop is more upturned. Notice how far in front the head is projecting. It's a much larger head profile relative to the Sharpie, and that's one of the first things that I'll look for, especially in soaring birds. Now, when we compare the wing flap, look at how much more of the wing is being used relative to our Sharpie. So it's not as quick, it's not as rapid, it's a stiffer wing beat, and again, it's using the entire wing. So it just feels like a more robust, a heavier wing flap than our very light sharp-shinned. Here in active flight, similar to the Sharpie, you're going to see that slight dropped or downturned wing when they're in a glide. So I keep talking about these ideas, comparing Sharpies and coops. The coop is on the left, the Sharpie is on the right, and we can see, that small head, the little pocket with the wrist of the wings thrown forward on the right there, versus the Cooper's hawk that has the larger, more projected head and the perpendicular wing shape relative to its body. So let's see these guys side by side in video.
The sharp-shinned versus Cooper's comparison represents one of the most difficult pairings, but there are clues that help distinguish the two. Notice the Cooper's hawk on the right has a longer, bulkier tail that also feels more round. Don't forget, however, the round versus square tail doesn't always hold true. Also notice the Sharpie on the left shows a smaller head that is tucked back closer to the body, where the Coop's head projects forward. While soaring, Sharpies will flap more often because they are less stable, where the coop holds steady. Also look as the sharp-shinned hawk is making tighter circles. The bird is actually starting to get ahead of the coop. Comparing the wing flap is easier when side by side. Notice the Cooper's hawk has a slightly slower wing beat, but more importantly, it's using more of the entire wing, whereas the Sharpie is quicker, snappier, and flaps more from the wrist outward. Check out this Sharpie displaying its tendency to flap more often, where the coop is gliding longer between flaps.
Okay, moving into our falcons now. So when we see this kestrel on the screen, comparing it to our accipiters, we're seeing much thinner, longer wings that come to a point. And, we're going to see that across all three of our falcons that we would see in the East. Today, we're going to focus on kestrel and merlin and the differences there. They're the trickier ones to decipher. If we look at the soaring profile, they're basically flat with a kestrel here. When I see this wing profile, it makes me think about banana peels. So they look like they have banana peels for wings, just whipping the air. Their glide profile is very similar to Sharpies and coops in that they're downturned wings. And the other similarity between kestrels and the accipiters is they will tend to do the flap, flap, flap glide technique similar to our Sharpies and coops. These birds are incredibly nimble. They go up and down and left and right in the sky. They typically don't hold their position in the sky like merlins do. And so this is a good thing to look for. While kestrels will hunt on the wing and go after especially insects in migration, they won't do this as aggressively or as much as our merlins will. So again, a couple behavioral traits that you'll want to look for. I always describe kestrels as being mostly dainty overall. They're very light and buoyant. They're all over the sky. They go up and down and left and right. And it just gives this overall light feeling about them. Let's see the kestrel in flight. So again, soaring, the wings are held mostly flat and basically straight out, perpendicular from the body, very thin, banana peel-like wings. And they're, again, very buoyant and can be animated in flight, whether they're in active flight or in soaring. Notice how this bird is just moving about the sky. You see the clouds moving up and down and left and right. This is a classic flight of an American kestrel. As we get into our active flight, we'll notice that slight downturn dropping wing shape, and the bird is you're going to see the bird do the flapping and gliding similar to our Sharpies. Notice how shallow the wing beat is as well. It's very direct, but it's very shallow in terms of how high and below the body it goes. there's a really nice view of the flat, flat, flat glide and the slight downturned wing shape. So in contrast to our kestrel, let's talk about Merlin. So one of the best things I learned from one of my mentors that's really stuck with me, Merlins look like kestrels on steroids. So if a kestrel were to go to the gym and work out and lift weights, it would become a Merlin. And so notice in the picture here, we can see a stockier look all around, even throughout the body. It's just a heavier looking bird, and the wings themselves are heavier and stockier looking as well. You may have heard me mention the kestrels are buoyant and they go all over the sky. Merlins tend to follow a direct line of flight. They go from point A to point B incredibly fast. And from a behavior perspective, they tend to hug tree lines at very low altitude. If you're at a hawk watch and you hear someone say Merlin, you're better off to look behind you than in front of you. Most of the time, we find Merlins right when they're on top of us, and by the time you call it out, they're already well behind where you're facing. So if you hear someone call out Merlin, I would look up and behind you to start. They are incredibly fearless. When they're not going from point A to point B, they are either hunting, going after songbirds or insects, or they're going after other raptors in their space because they don't want anyone near them. So these are great behavior things to look for. They'll often be heard in migration. You can hear them screaming versus the kestrels and other raptors that are typically quiet. So another, behavioral tip to look for. Let's see these rockets in flight. So again, much stockier overall. This will make more sense when we show the comparison video, but a heavier, stockier look overall. Even the wing beat is slightly slower. It feels stiffer and heavier. Here's a bird that's soaring. And by the way, they're very hard to find soaring. You wouldn't believe the amount of time I had to spend to find a soaring Merlin. There's that very heavy, thick wing shape. It's not so symmetrical like the banana peel of the kestrel wing on each side. Here's that wing beat. Most of the time the Merlins are in the air, they're going to be flapping their wings. They're not going to soar glide nearly as much as kestrels, and their wing flap or their wing beat is very piston-like. It just goes and goes and goes and goes. It never stops. All right, so here's a nice comparison of the thin, dainty look of the kestrel, especially in the long wings, versus the slightly thicker, heavier wings of our Merlin on the right. Not to mention a much darker overall appearance. So if you do have a good view and you see what appears to be a falcon that's very dark overall, you should consider a Merlin. Let's see these two side by side.
While these two raptors both have classic falcon wings, there are some key things to look for that will help you better tell them apart. Notice the Merlin on the left has slightly stockier wings. They are especially hefty from the body to the wrists. The kestrel on the right appears thinner and longer winged. In fact, everything about the kestrel is thinner all around. Be careful as both birds hold their wings slightly drooped in a soar. Be sure to pay attention to other clues. Notice the kestrel is rising and lowering, both while flapping and gliding. In active flight, the Merlin flaps more often and is more active overall. The wing beat of the Merlin is fast at a constant, even rate. They have a direct line of flight and rocket through it. The kestrel often flaps and glides in an alternating fashion. They're more buoyant and move around a lot in their space.
Okay, let's get into our bootios. So red-tailed hawks really, I always start with a red tail because they really become the benchmark that we're going to use to compare all the other bootios. Most of that really is due to just the sheer amount of red tails that we see. They're so common. We see so many of them, whether in migration or locally. It becomes a great bird to solidify and then use for comparison's sake. You heard me kind of compare that soaring profile of the Sharpie, somewhat similar to the red tail. I think the red tail is just a little deeper, but in a soar, you will see a slight dihedral, that upturned wing in our red tail. While we can see the reddish color in the tail here, just remember that first-year birds will not have the red tail yet, so you can't use that field mark as your 100% ID. In terms of their wing beat, especially in active flight, it's very fast relative to their body size, but still, it still represents a very Boodio-like wing beat. We're going to see in their glide profile, mostly flat overall when they're on a glide. And the wing beat just is very smooth and not as fluttery or as rapid as we're going to see in the accipiters. So let's see what that looks like, and we'll talk more through that. Here's the large, lanky, very comfortable, heavy red tail. They hold their own in a soar. Even in winds, you'll see them only, make minor adjustments against heavy winds. You can see the wing shape is extremely heavy. We consider it very muscly. So especially when we look at the trailing edge of the wing and the secondaries, they're very bulging. So it gives this appearance of like a large bicep on a bodybuilder turned upside down. So that wing shape is very, very key for a red tail. It's very heavy, very, very muscular. There's that slight upturned dihedral. And this bird is just incredibly stable as it's soaring through the sky. So when we look at the wing bait, it shows power and it's rhythmic, but it's also somewhat shallow considering the size of the wings. It's actually quite shallow, similar to what we saw in the kestrel. Notice how much more powerful that wing beat is relative to our dainty Sharpie or the kestrel that we saw earlier. So we're looking for that very muscular shape and a much more heavier wing beat. Compared to that heavy, lanky look that we just saw, when we see a red-shouldered hawk, it's the complete opposite. So these birds tend to look like large accipiters versus Bootios. In fact, when you see a red-shouldered at a distance, they can really play tricks on you in thinking that you might have an accipiter here. But when the bird gets closer and you realize, nope, I can see not as long a tail, the broader wings, and the body shape of a Bootio, then you know it's almost always going to be a red-shouldered. They are accipiter-like in their wing flap and their wing beat. It's much quicker and snappier than what we just saw in the red-tailed hawk. I love to look for soaring red-shouldered hawks because when they come around and they're perpendicular to you, their wings are actually thrown or pushed forward in the shape of a C. We're going to see that in the video here, but we'll look for that. Their glide profile, similar to the red tail, shows drooped wings, but it's much more exaggerated. So they have a very heavy drooped wing appearance when they're in a glide. And this is something that you can see from even a great distance. Even if you're looking to the south and you have a silhouetted bird, you can see in both juvenile and adult red-shouldered hawks, you can see these crescent shapes, these long crescents in the outer primary feathers that kind of light up like stained glass windows in a church. And all juvenile Bootios will have windows that kind of are iridescent or light up, but the red-shouldered, they're not squarish looking windows, they're thin crescents. So if you see a thin crescent, even on a bird at a distance, that's a great piece of the puzzle to determine red-shouldered hawk. Now let's see this bird in flight. Notice the snappier, quicker wing beat, but as it comes around, you're going to see the larger, more broad wings of a classic Bootio right there. And now you can see that wing is pushed forward. It's creating a shallow letter C. You're not going to see that in a broad wing. They're basically perpendicular, straight lined. So that's a nice way to tell a red-shouldered from a broad wing in a soar. Notice a pretty flat soaring profile. And then when we get into active flight, we see a slightly deeper wing beat than the red-tailed that we saw earlier, but it's snappier and slightly quicker, more reminiscent of the accipiters that we saw earlier. These birds also tend to look like they have a slightly longer tail for a buteo, but definitely not long enough to be an accipiter. Here's that heavy drooped appearance of a gliding red-shouldered. So we know it's a buteo, but it's definitely not as heavy or muscular as the red-tailed that we saw earlier. Here's another bird starting to get into a glide, and you see it slowly dropping its wings as it enters that flight. Our last buteo for today is the famed broad-winged hawk, which offers us a lot of behavioral and family group possibilities to help us with determining identification. I love to show the adult and juvenile side by side. Much like all the other birds, the shape is exactly the same. So if you just ignore the field marks and look at the overall shape of these birds, everything else is the same. A lot of the books will describe the shape of the wing like a paring knife. And that is, you can see that here as the wing goes out somewhat perpendicular, and then it comes to a point, goes down to a point at the end. If you go up to your kitchens and pull out a paring knife, it looks like the bird has a paring knife on each side of its body. This is a bird where you're not really going to see much, if any, difference between the glide and soar profiles. They're going to be basically flat throughout. And one of the things that I always, notice about broadwings, whether they're immature or in adult form, they're always very clean. They look very clean and proper. So whether they're molting or not, typically in migration, you're going to see birds that look really clean and their feathers are in really good shape. Notice on the adult, you can see the trailing edge of the wings has a nice dark border. That is something that you can see when the lighting is just right. Let's see what this bird looks like by itself. Notice the flat winged appearance in a soar, and there's that paring knife view. This is an adult bird. The lighting's nice enough that you can see that dark edge to the trailing edge of the wings, the dark border. And here's that paring knife shape, so that both the trailing and front edge of the wings go out straight, and then it comes to a point at the end. Very, very similar to our paring knife. These birds are incredible at soaring. They're the masters of soaring. They're known for coming through in very large groups, especially in fall. And so that's something that we can look for. We'll see that a little bit later. There's that paring knife shape again. And as we get into the gliding and flapping of this bird, you're going to see that the wings are still flat overall. It's a slightly stiffer, slightly more rhythmic wing beat compared to the red-shouldered hawk, but still nowhere near as heavy and muscular as the red-tailed that we saw. In fact, there's a red-tailed low coming in. Look how much heavier and large and muscular that bird looks relative to the broadwing on top. All right, so we saw an individual broadwing, but where broadwings come into their own is when they're together. So they're known for, large flights, large groups that come through, and it's our, goal as hawk watchers to be there at the right time to see these massive flights. And when you get it right, you can see them moving in just huge groups that we call kettles. This is just a very small example of a kettle from the Detroit River Hawk Watch a few falls ago. This is almost exclusively broad-winged hawks, and this is a great behavioral trait to have in your hip pocket for identifying. If you are seeing a large group of what looks to be the same buteo, and you're in the third or fourth week in September in fall in roughly the Midwest, I can guarantee you are looking at broadwings. So then it becomes the test of the hawk watcher to find the anomalies while at the same time figuring out how many I'm seeing in this group. And rather than looking at that group to gain a count, we're going to wait to do that until they stream out. So when they're soaring in those kettles and they get to the top, they're going to stream out and they're losing altitude. They lose the thermal activity. That's when they're going to jump out of the soar and go into more of the active flight or gliding, getting from point A to point B. And we're seeing this right now in mostly all broadwings here. You're seeing a lot of flapping because these birds are getting low in altitude. Now they're starting to spread out to try and find the next thermal to keep that going. You start to see the birds start coming back, and they're finding the next thermal and re-entering that kettle to get into the soar and rise in altitude, and basically rinse and repeat all the way down to Central and South America. So use that behavior to your advantage. Okay, a few more. We'll talk our eagles next. So our bald eagle, I love this photo because it just proves the point of a bald eagle shape so well. It's like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and tail. It's literally, it's just a plank-like, very rectangular wing shape. And that's something that we're going to look for when we're comparing the bald to the golden eagle. In addition to that, we look at the soaring profile versus the glide profile. They're both pretty well flat. But what's interesting about the glide profile in a bald eagle is each wing into itself will show a slight curve or bow to it. And at a really great distance, these birds can actually trick you into thinking you might have an osprey when they're really far out. But once they get close enough and you see the heavy lankiness of the bird, you know right away it's not the thinner, longer wing osprey. The other thing that we're going to really look at outside of a very slow, methodical wing beat, powerful wing beat, is the head length relative to the tail length. These birds appear to have huge heads with a lot of forward projection, and we're going to see that in the video, and then we'll compare that to the golden eagle. So here's our bald eagle. Look for that long, rectangular shaped wing, that plank-like wing. Not much upturn or downturn to the wing. It's very flat overall. And look how comfortable this bird is in the air. They're absolutely heavy. They're like the massive bomber jets in the military. They're just very stable, very heavy. There's that plank rectangular wing that we're seeing. But look at the size of the head relative to the length of the tail. So it's just absolutely huge. The books will say that the head is at least half the length of the tail or more. In that view, you could see it. The head almost looks the same length as the tail. Here's what I call a somewhat shallow wing beat of the bald eagle, but it goes higher above the body. The upturn or the upside of the wing beat goes much higher than it does below the body. And when the bird stops flapping, it stops on a downbeat. There, we just saw it again. And there's that flat overall appearance in a glide, but you can see a shallow bow on each side within each wing itself. So again, overall, a very shallow wing beat. It's also very powerful. And the wing beat goes much further up above the body than it does below the body. So relative to that, while we see still similar, somewhat of a rectangular wing, there's more of a bootio feel to golden eagles. They have a little bit more muscular view or look about them, especially in the trailing edge where the secondary flight feathers are. So it gives them a more bootio-like appearance versus that straight, heavy bald eagle wing that we just talked through. Look at the soaring profile. It's very different than the bald eagle. You're going to see a red-tailed like dihedral where you have that slight upturned wing in a golden eagle. And you can see this from way out. They look more like turkey vultures at a distance than something like a bald eagle. Their glide profile is also what's called a modified dihedral, where it upturns from the body, but then it goes flat from the wrists outward. So that's something very peculiar that we can look for in our goldens. They have a similarly powerful wing beat compared to the bald eagle, but they, when they're flapping and they stop their flap, they stop on an upturn and then settle into that dihedral that we were talking about earlier. What I want you to really pay close attention to is the small nature of the head in the video that we're about to see. So these soaring birds are just as heavy, just as comfortable in a soar, but the wing flap isn't as stiff, it's more flexible. So it's not as stiff, it's more flexible. There's that slight upturn dihedral that we see in the golden that we won't see in a bald eagle. And then as it comes around, let's look for that really small head relative to what seems like a longer tail. So really try to find that smaller head. There we can almost see in that angle, almost no head. They almost appear like a turkey vulture. But as it comes around, you'll see the head just it's hard to find. It's much smaller than what we see in the bald eagle that we just saw. So here in active flight, we do see a dihedral, and there's that more flexible wing beat. It's not as stiff. And when they stop flapping, they stop on an upbeat and then settle into the glide, just like you saw there. And that golden eagle was from Whitefish Point for you Michigan people. So let's do a little bit of comparison between the two. Here's the head and tail. So when we look on the right at the bald eagle, I mean, the head is literally the same size as the tail at this particular angle. While the head is projected forward on the golden, which is on the left, the tail is much longer, and you're going to notice it much more in the videos or when you see them live in person. So let's compare these two together.
Bald and golden eagles are both large and prominent in the sky, but some key differences are easy to pick out once you know what to look for. Even though the bald eagle on the left is closer, it shows thick, rectangular planked wings. It looks like a 2x8 plank of wood with a head and a tail. Speaking of heads, make sure to key in on the size of the head compared to the length of the tail. The bald eagle's head can appear as long as its tail, where the golden's head appears to be half the length of its tail or smaller. The golden on the right appears more bootial-like with more muscular wings. Notice too, the bald eagle is soaring with flat wings. In comparison, the golden eagle has a slight upturned dihedral. The wing beat of the bald eagle is slow and stiff, but look at that deep upstroke. Golden eagles have slow wing beats as well, but they're uniformly shallow. Check out how the bald eagle ends on a downstroke when flapping. In comparison, the golden eagle ends on an upstroke before settling into its glide.
Okay, just the last couple, and then we'll go through, give you guys an opportunity to choose some different side-by-sides that we can go through. Not going to spend a huge amount of time on turkey vultures. This is similar to a red tail in that it's like a benchmark species. We see so many vultures. It's a great one to just solidify for comparing to others. Their soaring profile is very, very steep dihedral, so that heavy V. And much like the golden eagle, they have a modified dihedral when they're in active flight. They don't flap very often, but they do flap their wings. And so what we're looking for is mostly soaring or gliding, and they tend to be very buoyant and rock around when they're flying. So we'll see that here. Here you can see a very, very steady bird. You noticed at the beginning it kind of flexed its wings. This is a classic behavior of a turkey vulture. Notice it rocking back and forth and even slight winds. They're very, very buoyant, and it's like they want nothing to do with flapping their wings. They do everything possible to stay in a glide or a soar. They also appear nearly headless, especially at a distance. Here we see that heavy dihedral, that upturned wing. You can't even see a head until it turns around, and then barely you can just see it at the right angle. It has a head. So we're looking for that teetering, rocking flight, stiff dihedral, upturned wing, and that rockiness about them. Here we can see the modified dihedral as a vulture's gliding towards the camera. Again, the wing leaves the body going up, and then it flattens out from wrist to tip. There's the wing flap, so that proves they flap their wings. There's a wives' tale. Some people say they never flap, but they do. And lastly, we'll go through our northern harrier. We see a male, the gray ghost, on the right, and a female on the left. We look at the soaring profiles, very similar both in soaring and gliding to our turkey vulture. Very pronounced upturned dihedral, both when they're soaring and gliding. A little bit more of that modified dihedral when they're gliding. These birds have very long tails, but even though that accipiter has a long tail, accipiters have more broad, short, stubby wings. These birds have very long, thin, plank-like wings. So where I said the bald eagle looks like a 2x8 plank of wood, this looks like a 2x4 plank of wood. It's very rectangular, but it's thinner than what we saw in that eagle. So here's our soaring harrier. Notice the upturned dihedral, very, very stiff. They also will teeter and rock a little bit, similar to what we saw in the vulture. I find, especially at Whitefish Point, way out at a distance, I can be tricked by harriers and vultures because of the distance. Notice the long tail, and then again, that very thin, long, rectangular wing. They tend to sweep back the tips of their wings in active flight. They look a little bit more falcon-like in active flight, but there's that stiff dihedral with a little bit of that modified look to it. Notice the slight teetering as the bird's flying by, and there's a really good look at the modified dihedral as the bird's in active flight. Beautiful birds. We love to see the males in flight. That's always a treat at any hawk watch. Be careful with that white rump. A lot of times people say, well, I saw the bird, it had a white rump. Especially in high winds, juvenile bootios will show white rump appearance where their undertail covert feathers are kind of like folding up in the wind. And even Cooper's hawks, you'll see rump feathers that will look like a tail of a northern harrier. Okay, so before we get into questions, I want to offer, feel free to chat, put in the chat here. These are all the side-by-sides that can be found on Hawks on the Wing. If you have one in mind that you're looking for, that you'd like to play, throw it in the chat and we'll throw a couple of those out there. And then we'll spend the last few minutes of our time today to engage in some questions. So feel free to put them in the chat. If I don't see anything in a minute, I'll just go ahead and choose one. And I'll focus, rough-legged and harrier. That's the first one. I'll do that one first. Keep throwing them out there and we'll put them in there. So this is good. We've got a rough-legged, which is the bird we didn't focus on today.
But there are some key clues that will solve the mystery every time. Both birds are buoyant, especially when soaring. But notice the rough-legged hawk on the left is flapping intermittently, where the northern harrier on the right avoids flapping. Check out the shape of the harrier's wings. They are even throughout and look like 2x4 planks of wood in a soar, where the rough-legged has broader wings that retain the buteo appearance. The harrier will also have a steeper dihedral and hold its wings mostly perpendicular to its body, where the rough-legged has a less severe dihedral and its wings are pushed forward. In active flight, the shape of the birds is definitely something to key in on. Both birds typically glide with modified dihedrals. However, the northern harrier will gently rise from the wrist to the tip, where the rough-legged is flat from the wrist to the tip. The harrier's wing flap is more from the wrists out, and it looks like the bird is bouncing basketballs with its wings. Rough-leggeds make flapping look easy with stiff yet powerful wing beats.
Okay, I saw goshawk and Cooper's hawk among the many suggestions. I think that's a really good one. Then Julie or Kat, feel free to recommend one.
Even though goshawks are larger than Cooper's hawks, size is often hard to judge with lone birds. Check out the goshawk on the left. The bird has a thicker, square-looking tail and slightly stockier-looking wings, giving hints of striving to be a buteo. The Cooper's hawk on the right is long-tailed with thinner-looking wings compared to the goshawk. When soaring, these birds hold their wings in a slightly different manner. The goshawk holds its wings flat, where the coop is showing a slight upturn or dihedral. Just as sharpies make tighter circles than coops when soaring, coops make tighter circles than goshawks. Notice how in control the goshawk is on the left. Its wing beat is also very smooth and powerful. In contrast, the Cooper's hawk is flapping more and seems less stable as it rises and drops in the air. Look at the goshawk's large head and extreme bulging on the trailing edges of its wings. The coop is stocky but nowhere near as muscular.
Okay, let's do one more. Go ahead, Kat.
I say black vulture and red-tailed hawk, suggested by Pamela. because we
Okay.
didn't have black vultures.
Yeah, great idea.
These similar-sized birds can be tricky, but red-taileds, especially east of the Rockies, are almost always light-colored compared to the extremely dark black vulture. In backlit conditions, keying in on some flight differences will help tell these birds apart. The soaring profile of the black vulture on the left shows plank-like wings that are rectangular throughout. The red-tailed hawk on the right has classic bootial wings that are extremely muscular. Also check out the lack of tail on the vulture. Sometimes even their legs can be seen trailing behind, looking like whitewashed sticks hanging off the tail. While both birds hold their wings in a dihedral while soaring, the black vulture will hold its wings at a steeper angle. The wing beat of the black vulture on the left is faster and feels hurried, where the red-tailed is more rhythmic and stays shallow.
Hey, I think for time, that's where we'll stop for today. Thank you all. I hope you really enjoyed what we put together today. Just know that that's just an overview, just a subset. We're hoping to do more, maybe even this fall. I think Julio mentioned that. And then before we go into questions, I mentioned Whitefish Point a couple times. Late breaking, the Hawk Migration Association and I are partnering on a meetup at Whitefish Point. It's pretty quick. It's going to happen next month, the weekend of April 24th. For those in the Midwest or willing to travel into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, it is a magical place to experience raptor migration. I'm really looking forward to this, and I really hope some of you will join me there. We're going to focus on taking this identification into the field and up to the next level. And we're also going to include photography as part of that meetup. So if you want to learn how to photograph raptors in flight, come and join me. With that, Kat, I'll turn things to you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I feel like everybody learned something today. There's so many little tips and tricks that you had for us. There's a few questions. We're kind of nearing the end of time, but I hope people can kind of stick around. The first one is a throwback. David would like to know which hawk was on the title page, and maybe this can be a quiz for everybody if they remember too.
Yeah, maybe I'll answer that at the end. Let's give
Okay.
people, if they have a memory of the opening slide, put your guess in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Roseanne asked, do you have any recommendations for eye protection when you're like looking at hawks?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, especially for someone who myself, I'm very sensitive to light, and I have to have sunglasses all the time, and I just cannot work binoculars with sunglasses. It just doesn't work for me. So I have sunglasses that offer me that protection. And even when it's cold, you have to have sunscreen on. It's crazy how fast your skin will burn, even in the colder environment. So both of those two things, and then but my sunglasses are such that I can lift them up and they kind of rest on my forehead while I pull up my binoculars to look at the bird. And then I'm always kind of looking out of my periphery where the sun is to make sure that I'm not panning into the sun. So I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And then Alan has a few questions. When did you first visit Lake Erie Metro Park, or Detroit River Hawkwatch?
The first year I was there was 2005, and it was the Southeast Michigan Raptor Research at that point in time. And then I counted there as a relief counter. I was there every weekend from probably 2005, 2006 to 2011-ish, 2012, if I recall.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And then this is an ID question. With immature red-shouldered hawks, the light area in the wing looks more like a somewhat wide triangle than a narrow crescent. And he wants to know, is that correct, or is he seeing that correctly?
Mm. That may have been something odd in the video. I will tell you, in real life, what you're going to see is a thinner, long crescent in the outer wings, not a square looking window.
Okay, great. And then last question from Alan is, when the turkey vulture was flapping, its body seemed to bounce up and down a bit. Is this different from the eagles? And do the bodies of the eagles bounce when flapping?
So all those birds that you saw, they're not really going to bounce their bodies that much. What you're seeing in that vulture clip was merely image stabilization issues in the processing of the video. So that you're going to see some upward movement of the body as they're flapping their wings, but not as much as what you saw in the video. So that's to catch that detail was pretty impressive.
I agree. And then we have a last question from Paul. How often would you see harriers flying high up? And would that mainly be in migration?
Absolutely, in migration. So that's the thing about flight in migration is oftentimes different than how these birds will hunt. And so, if you picture our accipiters who are forest dwelling raptors that have utmost maneuverability, that is not how they're going to fly when they're migrating because the goal in migration is getting from point A to point B in the most efficient manner. So harriers will absolutely be high in the sky in migration, where in hunting you see them over the marsh or the grassland at very, very low altitudes. Good question.
Awesome. And then so people have been answering in the chat. It looks like there's either Sharpie or Cooper's Hawk for the title slide. Can you reveal what it was?
It was a immature sharp-shinned hawk, and
Amazing.
the bird was taken at Whitefish Point. It's my favorite place for sharp-shinned hawk photography. They're some of the hardest birds. If you're a photographer, you know all too well. They're one of the hardest to photograph, and whitefish makes it so much easier. They're right. You almost feel like you can touch them on good flight days. So it was a Sharpie.
Awesome. So great job for those who caught that one and remembered it, which is equally impressive, I think. So once again, thank you so much, everybody. Always bringing great questions to our speakers. And I'm going to hand it back to Julie for a few words.
Thanks, Kat. Thank you so much, Josh. As always, just excellent presentation. And we're getting so much great feedback from people who joined. And we always appreciate, your tips, your helpful tips, your awesome photography, and seeing all your videos, I think really, really help. So hopefully people will be inspired to take some of this and head out to a hawk watch. Lots of sites are counting right now. Lots of migration coming up throughout the month of April. So I hope people get out hawk watching. We are going to bring Josh back just because this is such a popular program. So we'll do another little refresher mid-September. And maybe we can focus on some of the species we didn't have time to touch on too much today, or some Western birds maybe. So thank you so much. And for next month on April 15th, we're going to be hearing from Eden Rebecca, who's going to be speaking about her research with black kites in southern Spain. So this you can register for online on our website or on our Facebook page, or you can wait for me to send out the next e-newsletter and register there. That will be in early April. I'll send that out. It is great to see so much interest in our Lunch and Learns, and we've loved just seeing it grow over the years. It really has, and it's one of the ways we have to connect with everyone since HMA doesn't have a headquarters or a nature center somewhere. So if you enjoy these programs and value them, we really encourage you to join our kettle and become a member. We rely on our membership to provide programs like this, to help us run Hawk Count, to produce our journal, to give support back to the Migration Monitoring Network. So please consider a membership if you're not already a member. It's also Raptorathon season right now. So far, I think we have 6 teams participating. They're on our website. You can reach that at hawkmigration.org/Raptorathon, and that's a great way to support local Hawkwatch sites. Half of what teams raise go to supporting the site, and half goes to running HMA programs. And lastly, we are having a sale. If anyone is interested in getting some HMA swag. We are pretty much everything is on sale right now. We have t-shirts for 20. We have hats for sale for 25. Our hoodies are only 35. Lots of great merch, including Josh's Hawks on the Wing Hawk ID resources. So check that out at hawkmigration.org. And thank you, everybody, again for joining today. And thanks again to Josh. So hopefully we'll see everybody next month. Have a great day.